Tēnā koutou te whānau o Auckland Unitarians. Tēnā koutou nā manuhiri. No mai, haere mai. Haere mai ki tēnei whare karakia a te atua. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. A warm welcome to you all this morning. On this day in 1950, the UN General Assembly declared December 10th as the date for celebrating the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, passed by that same assembly 2 years before. Today we also celebrate the 115th anniversary of our first service in this sacred space, where we have promoted human rights throughout our history. The two go well together. On or about this date, we will focus on these twin anniversaries in the future by holding up one of the human rights the UN declared universal. This year, we are lifting up freedom of religion, which by implication includes freedom from religion. This particular right is still not universal, even here in New Zealand. While we are supposedly a secular state with no established church, we do have a dominant religion, Christianity. It still has hold over many of our state schools through the Bible in Schools program and in religious observances in school assemblies. I've invited one of our members, David Hines, to speak about efforts to rectify this violation of human rights through the courts and the Human Rights Commission. On February 27, 2007, I sent an opinion piece to the Herald, which they published. It was a response to our dear friend Brian Tamaki and his opposition to the proposed national statement on religious diversity. His objection was based on New Zealand being a Christian nation. My opening words are excerpts from my response, which I've updated where appropriate. In my resistance to deem New Zealand to be a Christian nation, if my resistance to it makes me a traitor, as Brian Tamaki suggests, take me to the Tower or the New Zealand equivalent, for it would be greatly preferable to living in such a country. Before Christians hasten to denounce my position, take a close look at the United States, the only Christian nation. To be fair, it should be described as a fundamentalist Christian nation. Such Christians, in my experience, imagine that no faith is more loving or forgiving than theirs, while hating and devaluing all other beliefs. They are totally intolerant of criticism, especially of the Bible they hold inerrant and the doctrines they draw from it. When so many countries, such as New Zealand, have been clearly blessed and cursed by Christianity, how can I say the United States is the only Christian nation? It's not because its motto in support of diversity, e pluribus unum, out of many one, was ominously replaced with in God we trust. And it's not because politicians who want to get elected in their speeches with God bless America, and by implication, no one else. It's because the evangelical Christian right, after losing the battle to have God mentioned in the Constitution in 1789, now strongly influences or controls every branch of government. They are using this power to rapidly dismantle the walls separating church and state, so carefully constructed by the Founding Fathers. This could not happen without the support of the American people. A Gallup poll shows that 53% of Americans believe the world was created in 6 days and the universe was created 6,000 years ago. 53%. Only 12% don't think an external personal deity had a hand in creation. If the American public had to vote on evolution versus intelligent design, scientists would lose 3-1. This is an embarrassing statistic. to me and those of us who are Americans here, but no less so than the statistic that 44% are convinced Jesus will return, according to biblical prophecy, sometime in the next 50 years, and the sooner the better. How does such a belief in an impending end of the world affect how they plan for a future that doesn't exist? No worries for them about wars with Iraq or possibly Iran, global warming, no problem. Better roads, education, medical research, eradication of AIDS, ending extreme poverty, lowering infant mortality, and the rest of the long list of social, economic, environmental, and geopolitical ills that face us can be ignored. What is ultimately important in a Christian nation is that all its citizens experience Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. Personal salvation is their sole concern. Personally experiencing Jesus' ultimate return in a sword-brandishing glory is their goal. Survival of the species isn't even on the list. Not only is it not on the list, they actively oppose anything that might delay Jesus' estimated time of arrival. He is expected, according to Scripture, to come in a time of great tribulation. So bring on war, famine, disease, and natural disaster. The more the better, for it will be that much sooner. A vengeful Jesus will come to square accounts with the infidel and lift the saved to heaven. Anyone who works for peace, especially in the Middle East, seeks to live respectfully with their non-Christian neighbors, feeds the non-Christian hungry without concern for their beliefs, or seeks to preserve gay and lesbians from the AIDS virus, is in league with the Antichrist. Ending human suffering is not what they are about. They reject the balanced approach of Carter, Clinton, and Obama to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They support Israel as it is the site of the final battle between Jesus and the Antichrist, according to the Bible. They are why the country with the best resources for medical research in the world is hampered in its use of stem cells, the most promising approach to curing an extensive number of diseases. They are why the present administration is indifferent to global warming. Earth is merely a stepping stone to something better. That was written during Bush's period. It could be argued fairly that New Zealand has a different religious history. So it wouldn't be an American version of a Christian nation. Maybe. But I suggest that only Christians who see the world like American evangelical fundamentalists think that declaring ourselves a Christian nation is a good thing. The rest of us welcome the proposed national statement on religious diversity. Our only reservation is that it promotes tolerating all beliefs. That sounds noble, but not all beliefs are created equal. As we see in America, some work against the common good. This chalice burns with twin flames. The first flame burns for those who seek and defend the right to a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, so that each person may live according to conscience in a democratically elected society. The second flame burns for the defenders of freedom, working against those who would impose their own religious beliefs on others through intimidation or legislation. May we tend this fire always, ever vigilant and courageous in the struggle for freedom and justice for all.
Good morning. I'd like to thank all of you, and especially Clay, for inviting me to be a member in this congregation and for inviting me today to speak about human rights and how it affects our state schools. I've been campaigning for secular schools for 4 years in the Secular Education Network, and just 6 weeks ago we launched a new campaign aiming to get the law changed by a ruling in the High Court. Previously, I've given a number of updates about this campaign and lit, I must be about a dozen candles about it. Today I'd like to give a broader picture and answer 3 questions. How did I personally get into this mess? A question my wife repeatedly asks me. What are the law changes that we are asking for? And why was a Unitarian leader in the 19th century one of the key figures in starting secular schools? I think that's a story that not everybody here may have heard, but there was a Unitarian at the back of it all. Well, last week we heard a speaker on Treaty of Waitangi and why everyone should care about this. My immediate reaction was, not another human right that I have to work for. How many causes can one person effectively promote without burnout? Well, part of the answer for me was a question that John Wesley raised. He said, don't just go to those who need you, go to those who need you most. And part of that means also going to those who can personally help you most, because your skills match that need. And on those counts, the secular education program pushes my personal buttons. There are personal reasons why I, more than most other people, am caring about this. I was in a civil rights hothouse when I was just a baby. I was born a week before the start of World War II, and my parents were pacifists. Some of their friends were sent to jail for their beliefs. My father and mother were Methodists, but they were not supported by their home congregation, many of whom ardently supported World War II. So I grew up thinking that I had to help save the world, and I might have to go it alone if necessary, as my parents did. Well, the Methodist Church became a little more anti-warlike after the end of the war, and it was involved in numerous civil rights issues. In fact, in 1983, I wrote a book about it, which I called it was their anniversary, the centennial of their church, and I called it Stir Gently for 100 years, because they had been involved with civil rights all their 100 years. They were fighting in pacifism in some cases. Some of them were engaged in the temperance cause, some in trade unionism, some in women's lib. They were among the first to be welcoming women getting the vote in New Zealand. They were campaigning against nuclear warships. I was part of a protest fleet myself. They were campaigning for Maori rights, fighting against Springbok tours, and most recently gay rights. I was also involved as a journalist in the last few of these campaigns. I got my toes personally trodden on by Honi Harawira at Bastion Point. I had several of my friends in fear of their lives during the Springbok tour, and I interviewed the head of the Catholic Bishops' Conference, and they did a backtrack on gay rights. One stage, we'll forget, the Catholic Church supported the homosexual law reform bill, and then one day they changed their mind, and I was the only journalist who went and asked them why. I was also a different kind of protest over atheism from age 7, when I started thinking about the theory of evolution. I didn't actually become an atheist at that point. I started trimming back things. I don't think God did evolution. I don't think God did this. And by the time I was about 60, God was left with almost nothing to do except be a symbol. But anyway, I was always curious about atheism, always believed that atheists had a right to their thoughts and that many of them might be right. I was a Methodist minister for 10 years and then became a lay preacher. I applied 3 times to come back into the Methodist ministry, starting in the year 2000, and I was accepted by the Methodist head office, but I was turned down by the parish they sent me to, because I was in a de facto relationship at the time. I never knew the Methodist Church had a law against de facto relationships. I had, in fact, as a minister, welcomed many of them, but suddenly that prejudice out of nowhere came out and bit me. And that was the first time that I realised that churches are allowed to discriminate against their own members. If a church wants to ban gay people, they can. They can't ban them in public office, but they can ban them serving in their own church. And I know that Clay himself found this out a few years later when he fought against the Anglican Church refusing to accept gay people for training. So human rights cuts different ways. When you're in a church, you can be bigoted if your church wants to be. The first time I was rejected as a trainee for the ministry, I wrote a book. I thought, well, I can't be preaching sermons, so I'll write some. And I wrote a book about the parables of Jesus, and I called it Jesus Was a Psychologist. And I gave a review of that book here a couple of years ago, amongst other places. The next time I was turned down for the ministry, I thought, well, I can talk to people on the internet. So I started an atheist-friendly website, and I put a sermon on it every Sunday for 3 years. And then in 2011, I got started on a different kind of ministry track. I heard an interview on Radio New Zealand's Spiritual Outlook, and I heard an atheist leader, Bill Cook, talking about atheist spirituality. And this opened a window for me, because although I had always been friendly to atheists, I had never before met one who was so friendly to religion. So I invited him to share with me in a service that I was taking in Pitt Street Methodist Church. Most of the congregation liked it. Bill and I found that we agreed on just about everything we could bring up in this little panel discussion. But a week later, I was hurled over the coals at the leaders' meeting, and a series of secret meetings was held in the Pitt Street Methodist Church that I wasn't even invited to do, but I later figured out the aim of these secret meetings was to get me kicked out. And they failed. But I still felt from that day on limited in what I could say in Methodist Church, knowing that there is a small group there who would rather I was not there. So for moral support, I thought, well, I can't get as much moral support I'd like from the Methodist Church. I will join the Association of Rationalists and Humanists if they are open-minded enough to accept a Methodist lay preacher among their members. And they were. They welcomed me with open arms. They invited me to give a speech about it, and the speech was so well received, we went on for about 2 hours afterwards of questions and answers. And the next week, you may not believe it, but the atheists in Auckland are among the most open-minded atheists in the world. And so I joined. And the very week that I joined up, they were discussing setting up the Secular Education Network. My first reaction was, oh no, here's me trying to be friendly to Methodists one week and to atheists the next week, and now the two of them are setting up to have a big fight, and they'll be asking me to take sides. But after listening to this discussion for about an hour, it started to dawn on me, this is just another civil rights cause. I have fought with Christians on many civil rights causes, and maybe there will be many Christians who will support what this group of atheists are doing. And I said that to the meeting. I said, if you are going to fight against religious discrimination in schools, there will be many Christians and people of other religions who will support you. And they believed me, and not only believed me, but gave me the job. And they said, we would like you to go and round up all these people and get them to join the Secular Education Network. And I did. And I met Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, and found almost universal support for them, for the idea of secular schools. We enlisted some of these people, and I then, a bit before this time, I had joined this congregation, but then I found that many people here were some of our strongest supporters. So far from being thought a weirdo for being a Christian atheist, I found I was actually in a strategic position, because I had reasonable standing on both sides of this fence, and I was able to help them find common ground. And I would say that's what the word secular means. It does not mean anti-religious. It means sharing common ground. And it means that our schools should be schools that stay on this common ground and do not get into evangelism. But they can be friendly to atheist children, they can be friendly to Christian children, to Jewish children. It should make no difference to them what religion they come when they are at school. So schools should be secular in that sense. So that's how I came to be in the Secular Education Network and being their public relations officer. And Clay was one of our first campaigners when we started in early 2012. He was supporting the Secular Education Network, didn't have that name then, and gave some interviews in the media which got a huge amount of attention, including some very negative attention from some members of the Anglican Church. Now, that's what the Secular Education Network does. It's mainly a website of people who discuss and share experiences. But in 2014, I started a separate group within the Secular Education Network, along with Tanya Jacob. The reason I did that was because although we had coming up to 1,500 members in the Secular Education Network complaining about Bible in schools, very few of them were actually doing anything on the ground to make it happen. There were a couple of dozen parents who had kids in schools that were being bullied and given a hard time because of Bible in schools, but only a few of these parents could actually have the courage to get up and fight for them. 5 of them actually succeeded in getting Bible in schools cancelled in their schools, including Point View School in South Auckland only last week. Their leader, Paul Bennett, is a teacher at another school. His children left Point View a couple of years ago because they went to intermediate by then. But he kept on protesting, even applied to go on the school board this year, though he had no children at that school, just so he could fight to stop their Bible in schools classes. And as of last week, he succeeded. But he is a very rare bird. Not many people are prepared to campaign against local schools. And Tanya and I were acting as mentors for a number of the people on the basis of the Secular Education Network Facebook page. When people said we were having a struggle with our local church, Tanya would ring up some of them and say, "Can I help?" She helped half a dozen schools in the South Island. I was in contact with about a dozen schools in the North Island, mentoring these people and saying, "Can we give you advice? Will you give evidence if we start a legal campaign?" And so we decided that changing the law was the only way we were going to work. No, we were never going to win fighting one school at a time. And so we roped in some of those parents to give evidence in our court case. We got Buddhists, Muslims, Hindus prepared to give evidence. And that's the team that we had set up beginning 2 years ago. February last year, we began a mediation with the Ministry of Education, chaired by the Human Rights Commission. We were aiming there to get some guidelines for schools. This was not aimed at cancelling Bible in schools, but interim measure to make Bible in schools less offensive. We had a very successful day for the ministry, and we had these people on our advisory team. Clay was one of the members of that negotiation, but it has absolutely got nowhere. Over a year, it's about a year since we had any correspondence from the ministry. The Human Rights Commission, which had been chairing it, walked out on us and said, we've had enough of this. And so it's all but dead, but we're not going to bury it yet because we've got one last shot to fire at it. So middle of last year, another member of the Secular Education Network, Jeff McClintock, launched a case in the High Court complaining about Red Beach School and also complaining about 2 sections of the Education Act, which permits Bible in schools. Well, in February this year, Tanya and I, since we were preparing for a court case of our own, decided we would apply to join Jeff's court case. And we were successful, but the success was not enough. The judges who said this said we were not able to bring any new evidence in. And this was ridiculous because Jeff only had evidence about Red Beach School. We had evidence from all these other schools, from all these other religions. And so it was actually, I think, a mistake that we applied to join his case. But anyway, his case failed on a technicality. He filed evidence late, and it was arguable whether it really was late. And he appealed to the Court of Appeal and lost, and he appealed to the Supreme Court and lost. Tanya and I saw this coming, and so on October 13 this year, 6 weeks ago, we lodged a fresh claim to try and succeed in the High Court where Jeff had failed. We lodged a statement of claim listing the 5 laws that we objected to. And I'll just like to briefly refer to those 5 laws. The first law we're opposing is Section 78 of the Education Act 1964. This is the law that says state primary schools, whenever they like, can invite volunteers to take over a group of their classrooms for religious instruction lessons. The law doesn't say they have to be Christian classes, but they all just happen to be Christian. except for 2 which are Muslim. Why do they happen to be Christian? Well, because the law was written for Christians, and they were the only ones who had the manpower and the evangelistic drive to actually use that loophole. Now, in about 800 primary schools, the actual number of schools is secret. They have been described as openly evangelistic by one of their leaders in 2011, but a few months later they got a new leader who sacked him and has been ever since denying it. 3 of us copies of the lesson books they use in these Bible in Schools classes, they also were a secret. We were barred from getting books from the New Zealand distributor of these books. I had to go to Australia to buy a copy of one of their handbooks. Paul Bennett, who I mentioned earlier, managed to get one by conning the people at the Church's Education, which prints it. He said, "I'm a teacher interested in Bible in Schools, and could I see one of your syllabuses?" And I said, "Sure." He didn't say he was opposed to it. So we got 7 by fair means and foul. We got 7 of the syllabuses used in Bible in Schools. We gave them to a religious studies professor, Paul Morris, who slated every one of them. Said not one of them was suitable for use in a primary school that had any non-Christian people at it. That section of the law also enables them to have religious assemblies, which could be Christian, could be Muslim, but in fact, by some strange coincidence, all happen to be Christian. The second law we're fighting against is Section 79 of the same Act. It gives the parents the right to opt their children out of these classes and is supposed to stop them from being discriminatory. But dozens of parents from the schools where this happened say this is even worse than putting our kids in the classes, because our kids are being stigmatised by being set aside. Most of these people are non-religious people. They're not atheists, they're just non-religious, and it's part of their life belief that their beliefs are private. They don't want people to know that they are dissenting from Christianity. And so for them to take their kids out of school suddenly gets them in for all kinds of flack. In one case, a couple of lesbian parents in an Auckland community were opposed to Bible in Schools, but because they were lesbians, they already were in flack because this was a very Christian community, and so they were afraid to take their kid out of religious instruction. That story has been repeated dozens of times. It's almost the norm for people to object to Bible in Schools, but to object even more to having to put their kids into a separate class. So a number of classes, a number of schools have Bible in Schools against the wishes of many of their kids' parents, but the parents are afraid to get up, and so they get bullied for it. In 6 schools, parents pull their kids out of these schools to avoid that bullying. Tanya was one of them. Jeff McClintock, who I mentioned from Red Beach, was another. They pulled their kids out of one school and took them to another. The third piece of law we are fighting is Section 77 of the Education Act. We actually agree with it because it says schools should be secular, but it says so in a faulty way. It says schools should be open at least 4 hours a day, and all the teaching should be secular. But in point of fact, most schools are open 5 hours a day, and so that for 100 odd years they've been using that fact to stick to say, well, the school's closed. It's 9 o'clock in the morning when we normally open, but the school is closed, so they get their religious instruction in that slot. And the fourth piece of law we're aiming at is the Education Act 1989. This is the law that made all New Zealand state schools independent. They could all set up their own boards, and the idea was that it would reflect, the schools would then be free to emphasise the values of the local community. But, surprise again, in hundreds of these local schools, the local community is predominantly Christian. The Christians are dominant on the Board of Education, and so surprisingly, many of these schools are basically going with what the Christian majority of their community wants. And worse, it's not only happening in the Bible in Schools classes, it also happens in their curriculum. I wondered at one stage whether our schools were allowed to teach about religion in their classes, and I contacted the Ministry of Education, got a very lengthy statement about this, And the answer is yes, they are. They are entitled to teach about all religions. They're entitled to teach about atheism. They've got a website which gives resources for them to do this. And I said to the ministry, but I know you've got the right to do it, does this actually happen? And you would not believe the answer. The answer was, we do not know. And we don't know because these schools are independent and we have no right to ask them such questions. And so I asked them, what is the law which stops you from inquiring? And they said it's Section 7 of the Education Act 1989. It says we may inquire into whether schools are up to scratch, whether the educational standards are adequate, but it does not include the right to question them about how they teach about religion. And so in practice, some of these schools are teaching about religion where they've got a board of trustees that wants it, but most of them are not teaching about religion at all. It probably comes up incidentally in social studies. It probably comes up when they teach about Diwali and a few other ceremonies. But by and large, religion is totally ignored in our state primary schools. That's the law we want to change. The fifth law, I won't get into, it's a bit long, but there are 5 laws altogether that we're wanting to take to court to get a judge to rule that they are discriminatory. So if you add all these 5 laws together, they create a huge endorsement of Christianity by the state and a huge pain for people of other beliefs. Now, the surprise thing for me was not that the Unitarian Church here supports secular education, because after all, freedom of conscience is up on the wall there, and it's something that you've been fighting for many years. And I was very surprised in researching the 19th century to find that one of the strongest advocates for secular education was a Unitarian leader, Robert Stout. He was at different times Minister of Education, he was Premier, he was Attorney General, he held lots of different government posts, and there's a list of a website of pamphlets by him, and a good half of them are about secular schools. And some of the things he said about secular schools were they needed to reject the sectarian philosophy of the church schools that they had up till then, because these were hostile to anybody who was not a Christian. They wanted to have universal education, and Robert Stout and others said, if there is a Christian, if each day opens with a Christian prayer, that makes the school unfriendly to anybody who is not a Christian. He said that there should be no access for religious teachers in the new schools. He said they should only teach subjects that were not religiously contentious. He said if you invited an Anglican priest in to talk to the children, it would be annoying the Methodists because it was not going to agree with what they said. He said that the state should not subsidise church schools because only a few religions could afford to run their own schools and all the others would be disadvantaged. He said that even if the education in church schools was satisfactory, children in them would learn religious prejudice just from the fact that they never met somebody from a different religion. You go to an Anglican church school, you're going to only learn an Anglican viewpoint, you're only going to meet Anglican friends, and that is going to make you suspicious of everybody else. When he quoted a French philosopher with approval, this philosopher said we should demand that nobody should be regarded as a scoundrel because he's an atheist, and no one should be regarded as a fool because he is religious. That was his philosophy of life, and he made that statement speaking in a sermon in a Unitarian church early last century. So I was absolutely delighted to meet someone pressing all the same buttons that we have been pushing for in the Secular Education Network, and doing it about 150 years before us. He beat us well and truly to the draw. And I would like to thank now the members of this congregation who've been giving me a very friendly welcome every time I've mentioned the subject. And I would like to say who are the supporters in this bid to get our schools made secular again. Well, in 2013, the census found that 42% of Kiwis have no religion. That's almost 2 million people. So you'd think we'd be pushed over getting this through Parliament. But most of those 2 million people are not atheists, they just nothing, and they have no political weight almost at all. But that same year, a research group did a survey of what people thought about religion in schools. and 47% of them opposed Bible in schools, only 27% supported it. So those non-religious people are obviously secretly wishing that there was not such a thing. But the number of 47% was actually higher than the number of non-religious people. So the survey people said there obviously are a number of Christians who also favour this, but a small number, but enough that between the two of them it's overwhelming that there is no support for religious instruction in schools. But UMA had another question. They said, what would you think about education in schools which treated all religions, but treated them all equally and didn't say which one was right? And that got a massive 74% in favour, and only 12% disagreed. So there we have it, the two aspects of religion in schools. Fairly high support, but not by no means overwhelming, to get rid of Bible in schools, but massive support for teaching about religion if it's done in a fair way, dealing with all religions. And I'm very pleased to say that our campaign is pushing both of those buttons. I don't think it will be still an easy fight, because the Christians are better organised than the non-religion, but we think that if there is a court case, this will be the clincher. We think if it was put to a group of politicians, I don't think we would get through. They are too scared of the vocal Christian minority. But if we win the court case, I think the vocal support will come in behind us. And I think the strongest support I have met, the only places where I can give a message like this, there's three places I can do it. One is in the humanists and rationalists. They are almost unanimously supporting us. Another is the other non-religious groups, such as the humanists. But I think the Unitarian Church is one of the few places where you can actually get the majority of people favouring freedom of religion. So I'd like to congratulate you for that open-mindedness, and hope that we may enlist that still further, and this may be decisive. Small in number, but united in purpose is a great way to get civil rights. Thank you.
For my closing words, on the occasion of remembering our 115-year journey, standing up for human rights, and especially freedom of religion, let us be mindful of the enduring bond that keeps us together. Let us remember those who went before and paved the road for us to travel. Let us remember our pioneers with admiration and gratitude, with honor and with joy. Memories are for us to cherish and to share. The future is for us to mold together. Let us be about that work.